We were looking at the last few days, really, the last day, basically, of Jesus' life on earth in Luke. And it's really going to be 3 parts because it's looking at, the time where they're basically arresting him, the time that they're in trial, and the time that they take him to the cross. Those are 3 separate sermons, as it were. And so today's we're looking at the arrest of Jesus, and then next week we'll look at the trials. And as we're looking at this, it's like it's historical fact. But why can we learn from it? Something caught my eye when I was reading. I think it was Constable, and he was saying, that Luke wrote this because you remember he's really uplifting Jesus, the Son of Man, as our supreme example of how we are to face persecution and suffering. It's not just, this is what happened to him, but this is how he dealt with it. And that's what we want to take a look at. How did he deal with his own persecution and suffering? Because he did say that if the world persecuted him and we follow him, we should expect persecution from the world even as it did against him. And so, how do we deal with it? This morning in Sunday school, we were talking to Thessalonians, the First Thessalonians, and I made mention that there was under persecution that they lost their hope, and they weren't dealing with it all that well. Have you ever met someone who exhibits poised grace in the midst of facing of adversity? Nothing seems to fluster them. They're just poised in grace, and everything else seems to be helter-skelter or all chaos. And there you see this person just poised in grace. Sue and I've talked about it often when in the Dominican Republic we had a missionary lady that was about 10 years older than us. They were the missionaries that took us under their wing, as it were, when we first went overseas. Esther Woodring, and it never seemed every time. And she went through a lot of stuff, much more than we did, because they went to the country when it was still not very easy to go to the country, and the kind of living conditions they had. And she went through a lot with her oldest daughter through the teenage years while they're in the Dominican Republic. And Esther always seemed like that person with poise and grace through the whole thing. And she's the one that I called when I was going to be thrown into jail. And I was so thankful she had poise and grace because I was totally frantic. And it's just nice to see those kind of people, right? In the midst of all that, they're like a rock, solid. Well, how about in the midst of persecution? It's one thing we think of everyday adversities, of just things happening in the world. But persecution that's unwarranted just because of your faith, because of your relationship with Christ. How do you deal with that with poise and grace? And again, it comes back to how did Jesus deal with it? And we're going to look at 4 paragraphs here. And it starts in the garden. So in verse 39 of chapter 22, coming out, he went to Mount of Olives, and as was his custom, and his disciples also followed him. And when he came to the place, he said to them, "Pray that you may not enter into temptation." And he was withdrawn from them about a stone's throw, and he knelt down and prayed, saying, "Father, if it is your will, take this cup away from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done." Then as the angel appeared to him between heavens, strengthening him, and being in agony, he prayed more earnestly. And then his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down up to the ground. And he rose up from prayer and had come to his disciples, and he found them sleeping from sorrow. And he said to them, "Why do you sleep? Arise and pray, lest you enter into temptation." And I think the first point here is that when heavily burdened with his suffering and death, because Jesus knew it was coming, he knew it was coming within hours. And the burden, if you think about the burden he had, he was sweating blood. Now, I sweat profusely. And being out the last 2 days out on the yard work, I was drenched, but I didn't see any blood. I wasn't in agony in spirit. My body, my muscles maybe were screaming, but in spirit, because that's where Jesus is at here, he's very burdened. And he fervently prayed to the Father. That's a huge thing, isn't it? He didn't look for a way of escape. No, he did pray. What was his desire? This first thing he says, he asked for any righteous way of escape for what was about to happen. He said, if it's your will, take this cup away from me. He's not saying, at all costs, I don't want to do this. No, he's saying, any righteous way, if it's according to your will. In other words, he wasn't looking for a shortcut out of it, but he was wondering if there's any other way that this could be done without him having to go through what he's knowing he's going to have to go through. But at the same time, he longed for the Father's will to be done no matter what the cost to him personally. I think that's the attitude, obviously, if we're going to face persecution. Yeah. Oh, good. Bring it on. Is that what no. It's like, no, if there's any righteous way of getting out of that kind of persecution, all of us would be in total agreement. Yeah. But at the same time, do we long for God's will to be done, even though it may cost dearly in regards to suffering or even death on our part? That's the mentality, I think, that Jesus had here. And I'm sure he was, I don't know, how do you describe disappointment for Jesus? Because he knows what's going to happen. He knows how people's weaknesses, and so how can you say he's disappointed when he finds his disciples sleeping? Right? But he says, as Jesus' disciples, prayer is a spiritual discipline that helps to avoid entering temptation in the midst of trials. What's the temptation? Well, think about James. Back many years ago, we talked about James. And it's in those trials that we are tempted to look for shortcuts. And he's praying to them, just as he's prayed for himself, that in those kind of trials, not to look for shortcuts, but to look for God's will to be done, no matter what the cost may be to you personally. And the only way that you can have that kind of strength is by praying. And you notice that it says that the angel appeared to him from heaven, strengthening him. Jesus, in his time of agony, in his time of need, as he had prayed to the Father. Well, we know that if we're going to pray as well in our time of need, in the midst of trials, especially in the persecution, that we know that God will strengthen us to be able to endure whatever may come. Now, prayer is easily discouraged by one's personal emotions and circumstances. Have you noticed that? I've never picked up on it before. Maybe you did when you read from Luke. He says he found them sleeping from sorrow. Does sorrow put you to sleep? What else are you going to do? You ever notice that when you're really sorrowful, there's nothing else you want to do but sleep? It's the hardest thing to do is actually to talk to God, isn't it? When you're so, and why were they sorrowful for? Well, they could sense from what Jesus was doing in what he's already told them that they were at the brink here of something happening. And they were sorrowful for what they knew was going to happen, even though they didn't want to believe it. But, Jesus said to them, "Why do you sleep? Arise and pray." Now, this is late at night, and I'm sure they've been busy all day, so did they have an excuse? Being in the Dominican Republic, it was hard because sometimes the pastors are at pastor's retreat. And they would say, "Okay, we're going to pray all night." And go, "Why?" So, if you've never been in an all-night prayer meeting, and it was in Spanish, and it's like there's no microphone, so it's like you can't even hardly hear half the people when they're actually praying. It's hard to stay awake. It's hard effort. And his disciples succumbed. It's easily discouraged. Prayer is easily discouraged by just our emotions. I don't feel like it. I don't want. By our circumstances. But Jesus is showing us here that that is the very time when fervent prayer is needed. And if anything, Luke is trying to prepare us as followers of the Son of Man who suffered for persecution that's going to come our way as we follow Him. Prayer. Verse 47. And while he was still speaking, behold, a multitude, and he who was called Judas, one of the 12, went before them and drew near to Jesus to kiss him. But Jesus said to him, Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss? Really? Get real. That's what I imagine my daughter to say. but really, can you see that behind us? Like, you're going to betray me with a kiss? The Son of Man, the Son of Man being what? The sovereign one? And you're going to come and betray him with a kiss of affection? Really? Verse 49, and when those saw him, what was going to happen, they said to him, Lord, shall we strike with the sword? And one of them struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his right ear. But Jesus answered and said to them, permit even this. And he touched his ear and healed him. Then Jesus said to the chief priests, captains of the temple, and the elders who had come to him, have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs? When I was with you daily in the temple, you did not try to seize me. But this is your hour and the power of darkness. When betrayed by Judas, Jesus peaceably surrendered to the arresting authorities. He didn't make a fuss and struggle. That's hard to think about doing, isn't it? There's one thing if someone's coming at you because of evil, trying to rob you, but if they're coming at us because of persecution for our faith, that's a different thing. And if it's coming at me for persecution of my faith, I need to respond as Jesus. It's not a war. A physical war. It's a spiritual war. And Jesus saw it as that. There's no point in denying if Jesus called Judas out for his incredible treachery. You couldn't think of a worse way of betraying someone after 3 years or so of ministry, a year and a half, definitely walking with him as one of the 12, seeing him every day, and still not coming to believe. How did Judas know he's going to be there? Because, as it said back in verse 39, it was his custom to go at night, to stay in the Mount Olives. We saw that earlier, a couple weeks ago. And so he knew where he's going to be. And he brought the authorities, because they didn't want the crowds around. They didn't want to have that kind of a support of the masses against what they were doing. And Jesus calmed the opposition, those who had come to arrest him, with the healing of the servant's ear. But I thought he said earlier that they had 2 swords. He said they're going to have to take up a sword. And so they said, we have 2 swords. And he said, it's enough, up back in verse 38. So didn't he want them to go ahead and start defending themselves? As I said last week, I don't think that's the idea. What were 2 swords going to do against the Roman army? Tell me. nothing. I think when he says it is enough, I think he's saying it's enough of this discussion, of this kind of a discussion that you want to try to defend, because he knew he was going to the cross. He knew he was going to have to suffer. And they're wanting to fight, like this is a physical warfare, that they're going to fight for him so that he's not arrested or whatever. And they didn't get it. And so Jesus basically, again, calls on the Father to say, permit even this, that he healed the servant's ear. But also, Jesus calmed the opposition because he understood the Father's will. He said, this is your hour. Remember there were times when Jesus was in Jerusalem and they were coming after him and he walked through the crowd and they didn't even touch him. And it says this was not his hour. And now it's saying that I know this is your hour. This is the hour the Father has determined that you are going to carry out what you've been wishing to do for a long time. So I understand that. And it's all being done in the power of the darkness because you're really being duped and you're really being controlled by the enemy, that's Satan himself. It's interesting that Jesus again had compassion on even those coming to arrest him because he knew that they were only being pawns in the spiritual warfare game, that the real enemy is Satan. And whenever people are coming to persecute us, even as believers in our world today, realize that they are not the ultimate enemy in the spiritual warfare, that the ultimate enemy is Satan himself, and they're only pawns that Satan is using. And we should have compassion on their destiny because they are destined to go to the lake of fire for all eternity. We know where we're going in Christ. They have no clue where they're going. We do. They don't want to hear it. Third instance we have in verse 54. Having arrested him, they led him and brought him into the high priest's house, but Peter followed at a distance. Now when they had kindled a fire in the midst of the courtyard and sat down together, Peter sat among them. And a certain servant girl, seeing him as he sat by the fire, looked intently at him and said, this man was also with him. But he denied him, saying, woman, I do not even know him. And after a little while, another saw him and said, you also are of them. And Peter said, man, I am not. Then about an hour had passed, and another confidently affirmed, saying, surely this fellow was with him, for he's a Galilean. And Peter said, man, I do not know what you are saying. And immediately, while he was still speaking, the rooster crowed. And the Lord turned and looked at Peter. And Peter remembered the word of the Lord, and how he had said to him, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. And so Peter went out and wept bitterly. See, when bailed on by Peter, because basically Peter bailed out on him, but so did all the other disciples in other gospel accounts. Peter was at least willing to follow along and went to the courtyard. All the others had scrammed way before then. Jesus intentionally glanced at Peter with gracious understanding. That's what I think. What do you think the look was? I don't think, we all have different looks. You know that, right? You don't have to say anything. There's a look. There's the dead look, like, you're a dead man. There's that look. Teachers have that look. Right? My kids knew when they gave them the eye or the look, they knew they better back off. Right? Yeah. She's shaking her head already because I told you that before. I was shaking her head, being in the car especially because I couldn't turn around. it got to the point where they would put their knees way up on the seat because I'd go like this, you know, that sweeping motion. And so they put their feet and their knees up on the seat. And so then I could do is just shake my head at them, and they would be shaking their head back in the back seat at me. They knew the look. What look do you think Peter saw when he looked at Jesus? As the commercial says, it had to have been priceless. Priceless, right? Because I don't see it was a look like disgust. I don't see that. I see Jesus looking at Peter, like I said, with gracious understanding, because Peter understood. Remember how much he fought Jesus, saying, you know, you're not going to die. You're not going to go to the cross. Get behind me, Satan. You know, he said, you're going to deny me 3 times. No, I'm not. Yes, you will. Before the rooster crows. Jesus says, don't fight. And other gospel says it was Peter who lopped off the ear of the servant. So Peter's been constantly saying, no, this is not going to happen, fighting it all the way. And when it finally realizes what had happened, it was exactly what Jesus said was going to happen, he felt shame. And I think the look that Jesus had was a gracious understanding that, yeah, Jesus knew this was going to happen. He said it was going to happen. He just felt merciful toward Peter, gracious toward him. See, Peter denied knowing Jesus 3 times before the rooster crowed, just as Jesus had predicted. And Peter departed in sorrow over his failure. You know, I've said it over and over, we're going to stand before the judgment seat of Christ. You wonder what kind of look this is going to give us. And you think of, you know, what's going to come to our mind is our own failures. Is what's going to come to our mind. But He's going to be gracious. But for all He's done for us, and we so easily, as Peter demonstrated, so easy bail out on Him. To do what? Self-preservation. We want to preserve this life. That's why He says many times over for disciples, he who loses his life will gain it. He who tries to save his life will lose it. In regards to reward. So, Jesus again, even though he was abandoned by the people closest to Him, He wasn't remorseful. He wasn't looking for vengeance against them. He wasn't wanting them to be harmed. In fact, we know from John's account that when he finally is alone with Peter and he says to him, Peter, get over it. And 3 times to counteract the 3 denials, he says, no, feed my sheep. Tend my lamb. Feed my sheep. Peter needed that reaffirmation that Jesus was not holding this against him for his failure. It was an opportunity for Peter himself to grow and to learn. But Jesus was gracious. In our world today, when we see someone who bails out on us, man, do we get mad at them. It's like, no grace. Where's the poise in grace? Right? We don't know all the circumstances. We don't know what God's doing in their life. But I can still be a person like Jesus with gracious understanding of other people's failures and not condemn them for failing me. Come to the last one, last paragraph in the section on being arrested. Verse 63. Now the men who held Jesus mocked Him and beat Him. And having blindfolded him, they struck him on the face and asked him, saying, Prophesy, who is the one who struck you? And many other things they blasphemously spoke against him. And so when physically beaten and verbally blasphemed, Jesus silently endured the abuse. That's hard to do. Physically and verbally being assaulted is not fun for anybody. Especially when it comes down to not any wrongdoing at all. It's because of who you are and what you believe. I know I'm reading behind the lines here because it's also with other Gospels in mind, but my points are that Jesus showed no ungodly reaction. He didn't respond with ungodliness to the unfair treatment that he was receiving in such a drastic, abusive way. And second of all, he did not pursue any personal retaliation. In fact, we know that on the cross he said, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. There was no idea on Jesus' part to retaliate. He knew that this was the Father's will. And he went through it and endured it because that was the Father's will. If we, in fact, are headed toward persecution in our own country for our faith in Christ, are we prepared for it? Already parts of our country are some places the church and believers are being persecuted. How are we going to respond? Here's Jesus' example of how to face that kind of persecution and suffering. Oh, that we might be more like Him, right? Let's pray. Father, we come before you, we thank you for your will that was done by your Son. Not an easy task to carry out. He gave His life so that we might live. And what He went through, from the agony to the betrayal of someone that's so close to Him, to the abandonment of someone that was even closer yet, to the abusive behavior, physically and verbally, by those who couldn't care less. He endured it all. Hebrews tells us that for the joy set he endured it with joy for that which was set before him. Because he knew what it meant for us. He knew what it meant for the Father's will. Thank you, Father, for His example. Thank you for His life. It's a new thing we pray.